The Silverstone circuit has hosted Formula 1 racing since the very first Grand Prix, back in 1950. Although it rotated between Aintree and Brands Hatch between the 1950s and 1980s, Silverstone has otherwise remained a constant on the Formula 1 calendar. With 4 British drivers currently on the grid, and a contract until 2034, Silverstone is in a good place. But it wasn't always that way. Back in 2008, Lewis Hamilton was poised to become Britain's first world champion since Damon Hill in 1996. He entered the British Grand Prix in 4th place in the drivers' standings. By the end of the weekend, he was in joint first, having won the race with a masterful drive in wet conditions. But despite hosting a memorable Grand Prix, Silverstone's F1 future was in doubt. Ahead of first practice that weekend, it was announced that the 2009 Grand Prix would be the last at Silverstone. The track's owners had long been in negotiations over a new contract with FIA President Bernie Ecclestone. Ecclestone wanted major improvements to the circuit before committing to the new deal. Midway through 2007, Silverstone's owners agreed to fund those improvements, which included a new grandstand and paddock and pit facilities. But Ecclestone still wasn't happy. He told the Daily Telegraph that even if the facilities were built on time, Silverstone would still need to pay a fee to the FIA to host Formula 1. By March 2008, the circuit published its full proposals, which were essentially what we see today. As well as moving the pit complex, corners would be reconfigured and a new pit straight was planned. The BDRC also planned 2 new hotels, a leisure complex and a test centre, with new homes also part of the plans. But by July of that year, Silverstone still looked set to lose Formula 1. Ecclestone announced that the Grand Prix would be hosted at Donington Park from the 2010 season. Donington's roots went back to wartime. It was used as a military base during the First and Second World Wars. In 1971, it was bought by British businessman Tom Wheatcroft, who had an ultimate dream of hosting Formula 1. The track failed to be included on the 1988 calendar, but instead hosted a race in 1993. The European Grand Prix was won by Ayrton Senna. Senna produced one of the most iconic moments in Formula 1 history, when he moved from 5th to 1st in the wet on lap 1. Donington, however, did not return for 1994, and stayed off the calendar. But then in 2007, Wheatcroft agreed to lease the circuit and museum to new ownership, Donington Ventures Limited, and that ultimately proved to be the catalyst for the FIA's agreement to bring Grand Prix racing back to the circuit. In January 2009, the local council approved an £100 million revamp of Donington Park, but there were still concerns. McLaren team principal Ron Dennis later questioned how Donington would afford the cost of hosting Formula 1, as well as the on-site facilities. In April 2009, the circuit had its domestic racing licence refused. The issue was related to safety concerns surrounding one of the new runoff areas, but that was not strictly related to Formula 1, and things began to look brighter by the summer. Donington would be granted a licence to host World Superbikes and MotoGP races after an inspection, and the circuit's leaseholders reached an out-of-court settlement with the Wheatcroft family over rent arrears. But any optimism would ultimately be misplaced. Donington had hoped to raise an £135 million bond to redevelop the circuit for Formula 1, but in October 2009, it announced that attempts to raise the money had failed. The leaseholders had failed to attract enough subscriptions before the deadline, and Ecclestone announced later that month that there would be no Donington in 2010. He blamed the 2008 financial crisis for the circuit not being able to raise the funds. But with no Silverstone deal yet, there was a prospect of no British Grand Prix at all in 2010. In December, however, the BDRC and the FIA put pen to paper on a new 17-year agreement. And in 2010, the British Grand Prix was ran on a modified Silverstone circuit. Red Bull's Mark Webber won the race ahead of Lewis Hamilton. With F1's popularity growing since then, Silverstone agreed a new 10-year extension with the FIA in 2024. But it has been a completely different story for Donington Park. The circuit's leaseholders went into administration in 2009, having failed in their Formula 1 bid. They still expressed hope that a Grand Prix could be held at Donington in 2011, but new leaseholders took over in 2010, and those plans never materialised. A company owned by former F1 driver Jonathan Palmer took over the circuit in 2017. And while F1 is now off the map, Donington still hosts elite motorsport, such as World Superbikes and the British Touring Car Championship. But as far as F1 is concerned, Silverstone is still in pole position.